if at all you've spent any Christian circles, you've heard about some of the historical doubts that people um, usually have when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. So we'll start with where this skepticism actually first comes from. Then we'll look at some of the historical schools, especially the critical historical Jesus studies. Then we will look at some of the objections that the critical historical method raises, so for the resurrection of Christ, and then we will conclude with every my general conclusion on the topic, and then I have a few more books that I would recommend on the subject. So. I know that being a little bit ambitious and trying to cover a lot of this ground, so we'll see if I can fit everything within 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, so first we want to be clear what we actually believe, right? So I want to start with the creed, right? If there are two creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. So this is an extract from the Nicene Creed. So it begins with, I believe in one God, the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And then it
Sorry,
slowly
sorry,
makes its
Fraser, to
way to,
interrupt. Are you sharing
oh,
your screen?
um,
Okay. Okay,
is anybody
sorry.
not
Yeah,
able
yeah.
to see
Thank
my
you, thank you.
screen?
Sorry, sorry.
Okay, is everybody able to see my screen?
Yeah, yeah. Now I'm able to.
Okay, okay. All right, thanks, Leslie. So we begin with the creed, and what I'm going to try to do is to try to confine myself to the elements of the creed that usually gets attacked when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, right? So the creed goes on to say that for our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he suffered death and was buried and rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, right? So. Um, what I've highlighted is usually the points that people have difficulty or raise objections to. Um, People might say like, "Well, he was actually never crucified," or people might say that he actually never suffered death, or people might actually say that he was not buried, or the common objection is that he never resurrected, right, on the third day. So we'll look at some of this aspect and how to defend this. In the context that we find ourselves in. So one important thing that I would like to point out is that this creed does not actually say that Jesus resurrected with a physical body, right? So I want to take this to sort of understand why the creed doesn't say that and uh, try to understand where the early Christians were coming from. So to do that, we'll look at first the cosmology of the New Testament. Okay, so on the picture on the left is from a medieval painting, but I think it actually helps to demonstrate the point across quite well. So when we look at how people view the cosmology, because we have our own cosmology in our day, right? We have the solar system, and we think that there are 9 planets in the solar system, and then we live within the Milky Way galaxy, and there are multiple galaxies. That is sort of what we actually think of when we think of cosmology in our modern day. But this is not the cosmology that the New Testament authors actually believed in. So the New Testament authors actually believed in a 7-layer structure of the heavens. Right. So if we look at here, first we start at the center, and then every layer goes contrinsically above it. So this is a picture of what Paul or Jesus might have thought of when they thought of the cosmology of the world that they live in. So if you look at the center, we have the Earth. This is the terrestrial. Um, this is the terrestrial body. So this is where we actually live. We live on Earth, and this is made up of the 5 elements of nature, right? You have 5 different elements like air, water, wind, so on and so forth. So there's like five, it's generally understood there's like 5 elements. But if you ask Paul what he thought, he would have said that, we are made of flesh and blood, right? So this is a phrase that Paul often uses in his letters because the flesh and blood for Paul generally refers to the terrestrial place. So where we're living is a realm of the flesh and blood. It has the 5 elements that we see around it. And then below the earth, you have a Hades, which is where the dead go. So when somebody dies, they go into Hades, which is below the earth, right? And then what happens in the above is the very first layer of Paul's cosmology is that you have angels, right? And then above angels, you have archangels, and then you have principalities, and then powers and dominions. And then when you go all the way to the top, you have the celestial beings. This is where the stars and the other planets, the moon and the sun, are actually at. So this is the celestial realm. So there's the terrestrial realm where we live, and then there's the celestial realm where the stars live, right? So a beautiful illustration of this cosmology and Paul is that when we read Ephesians 6, 11, and 12, he says, put on the whole armor of death that you may be able to stand against the vials of the devil. For we're not contending against flesh and blood, not this world, but the principalities, powers. So he's making his way through his cosmology. So you have principalities first, you have powers, but below principalities, you have the angels, and there are bad angels, right? And the angels can tempt the rulers of this world, they can cause all kinds of destruction in the world because for Paul, when something happens in the heavenly realm, it also gets reflected in the world, right? So we see this in the book of Revelation too. A lot of times, John will see what's happening in the heavenly realm, and then it gets translated in the earthly realm, right? So this is what he says in Ephesians 6, 11, and 12 against the world rulers of the present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places, right? So he's alluding to the fact that the world is dark because there's corruption in the heavenly realm, right? The other place where Paul talks about this is also like in Philippians 2 when he talks about the eschatological judgment, where he says, Jesus, the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, right? So this is like he's reducing his cosmology to three different things: heaven, right here, above at the top, where God lives, and then earth, right? And then under the earth, where Hades is, right? So, I hope that gives a good understanding. And he speaks about this in other places too. 2 Corinthians 12, where he says he knows of a man 14 years ago who was caught up in the third heaven, right? So scholars kind of understand that Paul is talking about himself, even though he's talking in the third person as if he is talking about someone else. He's actually really talking about himself. This is very evident because when you keep reading the passage, he goes on to say that he has a thorn in his flesh that God keeps in allows in him to be grounded. Um, so this is like a broad view of the cosmology that Paul, Jesus, and the New Testament authors quite what held very commonly, and I've actually brought up a reference from John 3 as well, where Jesus kind of implies the same cosmology. Okay, so as I said, this world is made of flesh and blood. That's what we are made of. And then the rest of nature is made of the five elements of air, water, wind, and two others which I can't quite recall. But anyway, so what is really the difference between this world, the celestial world, the terrestrial world, and the celestial world? So for Paul, this world is passing away. This is decaying. This is a place where there is sin, death, and corruption, right? So this is what Paul believes about the world that he actually lives in. So where does Jesus fit into all this, right? And how does his death and resurrection factor into this? So for Paul, since this world is actually governed by sin, death, and devil, what Jesus did on the cross was he nailed all three things to the cross so that the rest of the creation could be recreated, right? And he says this very beautifully in Colossians 2:20, 2:14, having canceled the bond which stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross, he disarmed the principalities and power, right? So what the cross of Jesus does is that it softens the power of the principalities and the angels who are fallen, right? So Jesus's death triumphs over these things. So Jesus' death triumphs over sin, death, and the devil. Okay, so now I want to shift our focus a little bit to the kind of what Paul believes or the New Testament authors believe about the resurrected body. So one thing that the New Testament authors are quite clear is that we will be raised with the spiritual body and not a physical body. So what does that mean? So to understand that, we have to understand that, as I said, there's the terrestrial sphere and then there's the celestial sphere. And the difference again is that the terrestrial place that we live in is dying and is passing away, but the celestial realm is permanent. Because if you look at the stars haven't changed. The stars have remained the same for thousands of years. So for Paul, the celestial realm is more substantial. It is more real than the earthly realities, right? So we can understand Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 in this way, where he talks there are celestial bodies and there are terrestrial bodies, but the glory of the celestial is one and the glory of the terrestrial another. There's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for stars differ from star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor and is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in a physical body, it is raised in a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there's a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Given it is not the spiritual which is first, but the physical, then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. Right? So this is, once we understand the cosmology that Paul is working with, it becomes really, really clear what he's actually saying. I want to make one very important clarification, which is when Paul says it's a spiritual body, we should not think of it as somehow the spirit is like a ghost in the machine that operates the body, right? So that's not what Paul means when he says spiritual. What he means is that it is the resurrected body is going to be of a substantially different material than the physical body. It is also going to be a lot more powerful, and it is made of the same things as the stars are, essentially, for Paul. So this is the framework that Paul is working with, right? And he makes it very clear, flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God, right? So he's saying that when we actually are resurrected and we go to inherit the kingdom of God, it's not going to be this very same body, but it's going to be transformed into something that's more spiritual and more powerful, right? So it's not like, you die and then your corpse is given life again. It's that this body will be transformed into something that's way more powerful and way more eternal than this flesh and blood body, right? I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that was the Hellenistic understanding of Hellenistic cosmology, and we should definitely understand the resurrection in those cosmological terms. And I think I've given you a lot of scriptural basis to sort of convey the point that this was the cosmology that they were working in. But we should also understand that people like Paul and the other New Testament authors, they do come from a very Jewish perspective. So they're very Hellenized Jews, right? So the people who are writing these texts. So what is the Jewish understanding of resurrection? So if you pay close attention to the Old Testament, you will realize that for the most part, the Old Testament does not really talk about anything called resurrection. What we see in the Old Testament for the predominant of its length is that people go to Hades. So there's this place called Hades where which sometimes gets translated as hell, but Hades is a place where the dead go and they lay indefinitely, right? And so the Hebrew mind sort of thinks about this, and when they are in the Second Temple period, they kind of sense that that cannot possibly be the case. So how is it that God can just let things go to dust? that doesn't make sense because how would there be justice if we just like went to Hades? And so what happens if you in the book of Daniel and Ezekiel is that there's a strong apocalyptic understanding where the Jews of the Second Temple are coming to understand that you don't just go die, there has to be a judgment, there has to be a reckoning at the end of history. So so they come to believe that um, when the Messiah comes, he will initiate a new age where people will come to life again. People will be resurrected. But they don't believe that this is going to happen for just one person. They think that this is going to happen for everybody, right? So a very good passage to go is in Ezekiel 37, I believe. I should have put it there, where we have this scene where God instructs Ezekiel to go to and speak to these dry bones, and these dry bones really come alive, right? And it is a picture of God resurrecting people who have gone on to Hades. And then during the intertestamental period, this is something that is debated, right? There's schools of thoughts who think that there will be resurrection, and then there's people who do not think that there will be resurrection. And so the group that does not believe in the resurrection, they think that people will just go to the veil of Abraham or the bosom of Abraham, right? So we see this in the parable of the that Jesus tells about Lazarus. The rich man dies and he goes to Hades, but Lazarus dies and he goes to the Vale of Abraham. He goes and spends eternity with Abraham, right? So that was also an expectation with some Jews that's what's going to happen is that people go into Abraham's bosom if God chooses to send them there. Okay, again, as I said, this does not this means that everything will be resurrected. And so from a Jewish perspective, we can understand how they might find it difficult to say that only Jesus resurrected, right? There's no such thing as like the one person resurrection. Resurrection is supposed to be for everybody, which is why Paul oftentimes says Jesus is the first fruits of new creation, or he says he's the firstborn, meaning that more resurrection is to come. Okay. So I hope that gives us quite an understanding of what we understand resurrection to be, and resurrection specifically in terms of the Hellenistic Jewish world that the New Testament authors lived in. And what Jesus did from the New Testament author's perspective is that he set forth the Messianic age, right? By his resurrection, he has started the Messianic age, but not only that, but he's also put to rest. He's basically defeated the powers and the principalities that actually rule this world. But the New Testament authors also do believe that there's such a thing as a final reckoning, right? And this is what we actually see in Revelation, where God sends to send Michael, the archangel, to actually go and defeat the devil, right? So there's also going to be like a final showdown of this, but the resurrection of Jesus has indeed put the powers and principalities to rest. So this is the New Testament understanding of the resurrection. Um, I will briefly stop here before we move on, and if anybody has any questions, they can ask. Or you could wait for the end as well. Okay, so now I want to move to see how how Hindu theology and metaphysics really think about cosmology, right? Um, and if we start with, okay, how does this really compare? How does the Hindu cosmology compare with the ancient Hellenistic understanding? What we will immediately see is that there are some similarities, but there are also like very, very important dissimilarities between the two cosmologies, which makes it very interesting and difficult for the Hindu perspective to actually accept the resurrection. Okay, so a brief word about the Hindu cosmology. So you have Bhuloka, which is like this, you could say like in Pauline terms, it would be the terrestrial sphere, where this is where like we live. And if you came to my first talk, you'll know that like the goal of what is considered to be salvation in the Hindu perspective is that in the Bhuloka is where the we come back forth again and again. We are reborn over and over again, called samsara, right? And the samsara happens in the Bhuloka, and your goal as a human being is to transcend the samsara and move up the scale, right? So Satyaloka is where God actually dwells. So you want to make it all the way up here through the different layers, through the heavens. And you can do you can actually do the opposite. You can actually go down. So if you've ever read Divine Comedy, it's like the circles of hell. Like in Divine Comedy, Dante like goes through the different circles of hell, and the idea is very similar here. You could also the further up you go, you're more liberated, you're more enlightened. The further down you go, the less liberated you are, and the more enslaved and um, darkened your mind is as you go down go down the layers below here. So I'm not gonna go ahead and explain all the different locus, be a little bit of a distraction, but I think you get the idea of how the cosmology of Hindu belief actually operates. So if you think about this, if from a Hindu perspective, if salvation is to be able to escape this, resurrection does not make sense because resurrection is telling us that you are going to be given a different, or like you're going to have a very powerful and a spiritual body in this world, right? But that is the opposite of salvation from a Hindu perspective, because if you're stuck here, that's not really something that is good. You want to go up further, right? So what the resurrection is claiming is that um, is that you're going to be stuck in this samsara, right? Essentially, eternally. And that does not sound like a good news to a person who believes this model of salvation. Um, okay, so as I said, so the resurrection doesn't make sense from a Hindu perspective because the goal is to escape the samsara and be united with God and not to be stuck here in the Bhuloka, right? Not definitely with the new body. The other reason is that from a Jewish perspective, it makes sense that there are two ages, this age and the age to come, and the age to come is something that the Messiah will initiate. Um, um, but the Hindu cosmology does not have a linear understanding of time. The Hindu cosmology has a very cyclical understanding of time, right? So, in the Hindu idea, there are different ages that circulate over and over again, right? And time goes on for eternity, essentially. Um, the other problem is that um, from a Hindu perspective, death is not an enemy. So if we read 1 Corinthians 15, the way that Paul ends the chapter is that he says, "O death, where is your sting? O death, where is your victory?" He assumes that death is something to be conquered, something unnatural about the human condition. But from a Hindu perspective, that's not really true. From a Hindu perspective, death is almost a door or a gateway. And you'll see passages in the New Testament which talks a little bit like that. But since they don't have an understanding of, because they have this understanding of samsara, death is not something that's to be afraid of or to be defeated. Um, but it is actually a real door, either into your next life or into your opportunity to go up the cosmological ladder, right? So, this is why resurrection doesn't make a lot of sense when we proclaim it to somebody who holds to the Hindu perspective on things. The other reason is because Hinduism sees liberation solely as individual, right? So your goal as a human being is to escape the samsara, and your soul has to be enlightened, and it has to be with God. Um, but in a Christian perspective, um, salvation is to the church, right? It's communal, but not only is it communal, but it is also cosmological. So we don't say that God is just going to save the church. he is also going to renew the entirety of the cosmos, the entirety of the created order. Um, but from a Hindu perspective, this whole cosmos is an illusion, a Maya. Even the self, the ego, is something to be gotten rid of. And so liberation from a Hindu perspective or salvation is purely individual and not communal, right? So this is another small objection that, goes through a Hindu's mind when we say, "Oh, Christ resurrected," right? We're thinking that this is a good thing, but from their perspective, it's really not a good thing. Okay, so how do we respond? And I think we have to respond by tackling the actual philosophical underpinnings. And like for some of this, I dealt with it in my first talk, What is Truth? So I would invite you to go and refer to that if you have questions about liberation and why that doesn't work from a Hindu perspective and so on and so forth. So the first argument that we can make is a very simple argument. We This is a more phenomenological argument, right? From our lived experience, this seems true. So the argument goes to something like this. We have an innate desire to resist death, right? Nobody's excited that we're gonna die, right? For a lot of us, it's an existential crisis when we actually first come to understand that we are going to die someday. And so our hearts actually long for something that is permanent and eternal. So, that is something that we can affirm, right? It is a very common human experience. And the C.S. Lewis makes this second point, which is God does not put in us a desire that is actually not there, right? So I cannot desire something that actually does not exist. So therefore, my innate desire for living forever and my soul to be immortal is not something that is a vain desire. It's not an unreal expectation. There must be something like eternal life that actually exists. But if that exists, then death is not natural because it brings an end to sort of that longing and our separation of soul and body, right? So this is, I wouldn't say this is like the strongest argument, but I think it's a good argument. And I think I've arranged it in such a way that the stronger arguments are to follow. So hang in there. Okay, so the second argument that death is not natural is to say that God's creative act, Sat being, right, which is again, I'll refer you back to my previous lecture where we talked about Satchitananda, which means being, bliss, and consciousness. And even Hindus can affirm that being is good. It is not to be frustrated eventually, right? So Athanasius on the Incarnation says it was unworthy of the goodness of God that creatures made by him should not be brought to nothing, right? So if Sat is good, being is good, then it should not be brought to frustration. Um, and we know that God is omnipotent and good, right? So this is also something that Hindus would affirm. He will bring all of creation to fulfillment, right? He wouldn't let it go to waste. Since we are body and soul, uh, the fulfillment of being itself should not be just the fulfillment of the soul, but also the body, right? So that shows that death is actually not natural and that resurrection is probably the fulfillment of creaturely life. That brings me, I think, what I personally think is like the strongest argument, which is we're made of body and soul, right? I think a lot of every Hindu would affirm this that we have a body and a soul. And death is the separation of the soul from the body, right? This is also a very reasonable thing to argue. If the soul is liberated but the body is not saved, that means the whole human nature is not saved, right? Only if your soul is the only thing that is saved, then your entire nature is not saved because your nature cannot be spoken of without your body because your nature requires both body and soul. Uh, Therefore, death is unnatural because it's the separation of body and soul, and it prevents us from the full uh, fulfillment of our natures, right? And therefore, death is unnatural, and resurrection is needed. Okay, so now we'll look into the idea that the time is linear and not cyclical. I think this can be quite easily demonstrated. We can say that time is created, excuse me, since time is created, it must have a beginning and an end. If it has a beginning and an end, that means that time is finite. Something that's finite cannot be cyclical, right? Cyclical nature means that it's indefinite and it's infinite almost, right? Again, not the strongest argument. This is a stronger form of an argument, I think. Um, so if history repeats itself in very cyclical fashion, then that means that there's no meaning to anything that happens in the world, right? But we do look for meaning in everything that we do as humans, and therefore it cannot be true that history repeats or time repeats in a cyclical fashion. That every time we move into the future, we are moving into a different potentiality. We're moving into a possibility, right? And that's what gives meaning to life, excuse me. Um, so that shows that time is not cyclical, but it's linear. And I think this is probably the strongest argument, which is if if history and the time is nature, there's ultimately no end to suffering, right? If we know that history is not going to end, if no final judgment to call what is good and what was bad about history and denounce what is bad, then there is no end to suffering, right? Um, this hits hard like when you think about like Buddhism, which is all about ending suffering, right? And you know the philosophy is you end suffering by getting rid of desire. Well, if you have a cyclical history, then there's no end to suffering, right? Because we experience suffering now, we experience suffering in the past, then we're going to indefinitely experience suffering, right? Um, the obvious problem with this being that if everything is cyclical and time is cyclical, then time must coexist with the God, in which case suffering must also coexist with God, which is not possible, right? Ultimately, evil has to be defeated, and that is a very human intuition. And if you believe in God, and if suffering must be ended, there must be a final judgment that God delivers to the world to denounce everything that's evil and wrong about the world. Okay, so final objection that I want to deal with is that salvation is not in isolation, right? Because of the nature of personhood. So what I mean by this is that what makes a person a person? What makes me me? It's all the memories and the people that I have associated with, right? If Delcy was not a part of my life, then I would be a different person. I would have been a better person, I don't know, but I would be a different person. So we are interconnected in this way. So that means that if somebody is saved and the other person's not saved, then the person who was saved is actually not really saved because part of them is not being saved. I hope that makes sense, right? So think of the most important person in your life and think if you would be the same person if it was not for that person in your life. And now imagine if that person's not saved and you are saved, then that means part of you is actually not saved. Okay? I think that's a very, very strong argument for the idea that liberation is an individual thing, an individual endeavor, like a lot of Vedanta philosophy actually claims. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and talk about Dulcie, how are we doing on time? How much time do we have? 23 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, how long you might need to face it?
I'll try to rush through. I think I'm halfway through the presentation. Um, so maybe
I
I'll
think you
skip
can
sort
take
of
another 20-25 minutes because we need to have some time for Q&A, right?
yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I can finish it in 20 minutes. Okay, thanks. All right, so I wanna now go
Or
on
if
to
you
sort of.
want, we can do a second session.
Oh, that's
But
also, yeah, that's possible, but uh we'll see.
but
We'll see
you
where we.
can try to cover as much as possible. If it
Okay.
seems that it is not possible to cover everything, then you can.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll try to cover as much as I can.
Or
Okay.
can we pause a bit for any questions?
Yeah, let's do that. We can pause
Yeah,
for a little
because
bit
after
and
9, I think people may not be available for questions.
sure. Okay. So why don't we do this? If people are not going to be available after 9, which is only 17 minutes from now, we can pause here and then we can come back for part two. We can pause for questions in the session and then we can come back for part two.
Yeah. One question from my side when you are talking about the Judaism and the resurrection in that context, right? I find it very interesting. So, even there are some disciples who come to Jesus and ask some questions, right? In the resurrection, how it will be like.
Hmm.
So, they do have some sort of idea of resurrection.
Hmm.
So, what is that idea and how was that developed after like Christ was resurrected and how did they understand basically that?
Uh, so the question is, Jesus's disciples had questions about the resurrection. Delcy, I don't think I understand the question. So you're saying Jesus's disciples had questions about the resurrection,
Yeah,
and how did?
see, there were some Pharisees who came and asked, right? Like,
Mhm.
especially when they wanted to trap him, because there is
Yes,
two group which believes
yes,
in
the
resurrection
Sadducees and
and
the Pharisees.
Pharisees
Yes,
who don't believe in resurrection.
yes.
So, so in that context, like when Jesus was explaining that on the third day this church will be built again
Temple,
and all that,
temple.
right?
Yeah, John chapter
Temple,
2.
sorry,
Yes,
temple will be built
you're good.
again.
It's okay. It's
And
okay.
then they actually see Jesus again and all that. So, what was happening there? That time and in context of Judaism.
Um, Okay, so the temple theology is a whole different topic of its own. But the reason, so one of the things that the gospel says when the Jewish leaders heard that Jesus resurrected was that they bribed the guards to tell them that some of his disciples came and stole it, right? Um, and I think that's because they're skeptical that there can be something as one, resurrection in the first place. Second, of the fact that only one person can be resurrected. So they're thinking, obviously, they're trying to be, Jesus' disciples are trying to trick people into believing in the resurrection when nothing happens. So, so different people come away with different explanations, right? So the people who already believe in the resurrection, they're more prone to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And the people who already didn't believe in the idea of a resurrection, they're coming up with excuses to not believe in the resurrection, right? Um, but I think if you just understand a person like Paul, who probably did have expectations um, 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 of the resurrection, the biggest problem Paul probably had was how is it that only one person um, could end up resurrecting? Because yes, that means the messianic age uh, is begun, but it also doesn't make a lot of sense because not everybody else is resurrected. So, which is why in Matthew you will see there's a really interesting passage where Matthew says there was a big earthquake outside the city of Jerusalem, and the saints actually flew in to the city, and a lot of people witnessed these people who were dead who came back, who were resurrected. Um, so, what I think Matthew is trying to show is that this is the resurrection of pretty much everybody, even though it is in a very limited way. And I think the other way that Paul comes to reality with this is that he kind of spiritualizes and says, you have the resurrection, but the power of resurrection if you are crucified with Christ. So this is something that we read in a lot of the epistles of Paul, is that he says, well, if you're buried with him, if you have crossed with him, um, if you have put yourself to death in the cross, then you have the resurrection power in you, right? So for him, a realized eschatology that really did happen to the believers in the church after the resurrection. So it's interesting how different people understand the resurrection based on what they actually believed at that time. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph.
yeah,
Yeah, if anyone has any questions they want to discuss, we can probably put it in chat. We can discuss.
no questions.
So actually, Fraser, when speaking in context of Hinduism, right?
Mhm.
So there are these beliefs that gods, takes different forms and then they come back
Mhm.
and again and again and again, right?
Mhm.
So how do we, uh, uh, I mean, how do we differentiate in our context, or how do we not help them misunderstand what we are talking when we talk about resurrection?
Um, hmm. Okay. So, Delcy, before I answer that question, I think I'll answer John's question because I saw it on the chat before.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So the question is, how does Jesus' resurrection relate to the fall of man slash original sin? I think that's a good question. I think the Bible, the New Testament authors don't have an idea of original sin, right? So the idea of original sin is a later development that happens, which does not mean that it's not true or it's not in the Bible. It's just that Paul probably didn't really think of the world in those terms. But what Paul really did think about was the fallen angels and demons that actually lived in these different layers of the cosmos, right? And the Paul kind of views the sin in two different ways. So sin, we commonly hear that sin is hermatia, which means missing the mark, which is certainly something that Paul believes in. He believes that um, sin is when you do something that you probably should not do. It's in violation of God's law. But he also views the sin as a cosmic power. It's not just something w- uh, it is something that controls people, right? It takes control of you and it makes you do things that you otherwise would not do, right? So in those terms, I think Paul definitely personifies the sin, and he thinks that Jesus nailed um 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 he definitely thinks that Jesus crucified sin onto the cross, right? And there's a link between the old body and the new resurrected body for Paul in this, right? Your old body is a body of sin, so you have to crucify it and kill it and get rid of it, right? And the new body is powered by the power of resurrection. I think that's how Paul primarily views uh, sin. Um, I hope that answered your question, John.
Yeah, and I was also thinking along the lines of I think it's what Romans 23, death is the wages of sin.
Hmm.
So death and Jesus's conquest over it is actually, restoring the original balance, like God's intended purpose for human beings.
True. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. So Delcy, I'll okay. I will try to answer your question. So what you're asking me is in Hindu belief, and I will try to address it from like Advaita Vedanta sort of standpoint, which is what a lot of Hindu theology teaches is that there's um, Sadguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman, right? So the God without forms, Brahman, right? And then the God with forms. Um, and what Hindu theology teaches is that for you to actually get to that level where you worship the God without forms, you can start with venerating gods that take the form of God, right? So you have these different incarnations and different forms in which, and this is where the whole 300 million gods idea comes from, is that God takes like different forms. Um, and so the question is, how do we make sure that people don't confuse the resurrection with this? And I think I would answer that in two parts. The first part is to sort of, because every heresy has like some kind of truth to it. So I think there's a little bit of truth to how Hindus understand like Nirguna Brahman and Sadguna Brahman. And the term that we have for that is created graces, right? So we experience God. Uh, uh, okay, this goes into a different rabbit hole and a different debate even within Christian theology, but we can say that there are certain things that are created graces, right? So we experience the grace of God in very normal ways, right? So we like for example, it's really beautiful day outside, right? And that's a little bit of God's grace. That's God's grace coming to us in a very physical form. We should never say that that is a salvific grace, right? So that grace that comes from the sunshine is not going to save you, but it does communicate the goodness of God from to us, and it relates to us just the way that these smaller forms of God relate in Hinduism relate to us in very tangible ways. The other thing, well, one of the reasons why I really wanted to speak about this cosmos is because I think we should really reclaim this ancient understanding of cosmology that we are surrounded by angels and demons that have a real impact in our lives. Uh, so that can counter sort of this, Nirguna Brahman idea where God takes forms. We can say that we interact with God's graces, we interact with God's other creation, but those are not things that we should supposed to be God Himself, right? I think that's the difference. And then the final idea is to kind of help them understand that the world that the Bible is written is very different from the world that they presuppose in their minds, right? So that would help them understand that resurrection is wholly different from this idea of God taking different forms. It's not just God taking different forms. God comes all the way from the top to the bottom so that we could go all the way up, right? And that's a very different understanding from how and the idea of Jacob's ladder, right? So ascending and descending. And Paul also talks about this. He says, like, where do I find knowledge? Do I have to ascend all the way up, or should I descend to the depths of the sea? But the answer is God has made his way down so that we could go up. Does that make sense, Delcy?
Yes, yes. Fraser, there is one more question. Can you just
Yeah.
see that?
So, what is the source of Jewish belief about Hades? Has it anything to do with Jewish scripture? I think it has everything to do with Jewish scripture. I think if you look at the Old Testament, there's no such thing as hell. There's no such thing as the idea of resurrection, as I said in my talk. The idea of a resurrection comes later. It comes during the second temple period. Um, it's after the exile, right? So that is when Jews actually start thinking about the idea or the possibility there might be a different age, there might be a different life after this life, right? That this is not the end of it all. So what I would say, Hema, is like go and read the Old Testament and try to find anything other than the idea of Hades. Um, uh, Actually, okay, so my bad. Let me take a step back. So in the Old Testament, you'll read the word Sheol, right? Which is the word for Hades. Hades is like the Greek word for the Hebrew word Sheol. And if you read the Old Testament, the Sheol is everywhere. It is, you read it in the Psalms, you read it in Proverbs, you read it like in the prophets, until you hit like Ezekiel and Daniel, when there's a strong apocalyptic understanding of the world, there's a strong understanding that there's going to be a resurrection, there's another life after this life. So that's where the idea of Hades or Sheol comes from.
Thank
Okay.
you, Fraser. Thank you for
Any other
that.
questions?
Any other questions, anyone? Or else we can meet in the next session of this continuation.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, and I'm honored for this opportunity. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
I'm
Fraser.
looking forward to the next one.
Everyone will discuss with Fraser and we can see how, when we can have the second part of the session. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fraser, for your time.
Yep. Thank you, Delcy. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Hope to see you again in the next one.